wait. Hello? Hello? Yeah. All right. While our erstwhile volunteer is handing out the raffle tickets, I will introduce these two gentlemen up here, although they need no introduction. Right here, well, let's Pharmacon panelists Win Scott Eckert and John Allen Small offer a variety pack of fiction, including John's tribute to Edgar Rice Burroughs and Philip Jose Farmer, The Bright Heart of Eternity. Win is a familiar face at summer's great PulpCon. Since Pharmacon joined Pulpfest in 2011, he's appeared on several panels, signed books, including The Scarlet Jaguar, and regaled audiences as part of our New Fictioneers presentations. And he's decided to share the stage with his friend John Allen Small. John grew up wanting to be a writer, and so he did, a journalist and columnist who has earned nearly 200 awards from the Society of Professional Journalists, National Newspaper Association, and other professional organizations. John hails from Oklahoma. He has also written fiction for The Avenger, Roaring Heart of the Crucible, Green Hornet, Still at Large, Worlds of Philip Jose Farmer, 2, Of Dust and Souls, and other works. He's authored 2 collections of his own and contributed to the new hardcover edition of his Apocalyptic Life and the forthcoming Tales of the Wold Newton Universe. As I said, he's going to be reading from Bright Heart of Eternity and the opening scene from his Avenger story, Ghost of Thunder Isle. 3-time New Fictioneer, Colorado's Win Scott Eckert returns to the Delaware Room with 2 new works. He'll be reading from the aforementioned Scarlet Jaguar, which he just signed this morning, in celebration of Doc's 80th anniversary, featuring Patricia Wildman, daughter of a certain bronze champion of justice. The Scarlet Jaguar is the sequel to Win's collaboration with Phil Farmer, The Evil in Pemberley House. He'll also be reading from A Girl and Her Cat, the first new Honey West novel in over 40 years. And this is forthcoming from Moonstone. It's co-written by Matthew Ball. And in it, Honey teams up with cat burglar turned bodyguard Thomas Hewitt Edward Cat, T.H.E. Cat. Wins the editor and contributor to Myths for the Modern Age, 2007 Locus Awards finalist, and has co-edited 3 Green Hornet anthologies. The third recently won the 2013 Pulp Arc Award for Best Anthology. Written tales of the Green Hornet, Zorro, Avenger, Phantom, Scarlet Pimpernel, Captain Midnight, and Sherlock Holmes, and they can be found in many Moonstone anthologies. It's been in anthologies such as Tales of the Wold Newton Universe, Tales of the Shadowman, and his acclaimed Crossovers was released by Black Coat in 2010. And Win has a website, which you can find on our Pulpfest website. Again, 2 more copies of Captain Hawkland and the Skyhook Pirates by Charles F. Milhouse and released by Stormgate Publishing. This is a new Pulp fiction and kind of a movie serial spin-off. So we'll have our readers pick this time. He had his eyes for it. And John. Okay, our first winner, 846294. All right, lucky boy here. 846283. Uh-oh, they both have one. Wow, they can sit They can be at bedtime. They can be right next door to each other and reading. Why? You sure? All right. Win. One more time. All right. 846-282. It's probably her. No, oh, okay, that's the lucky corner. All right. And now I'll turn it over to our fine readers. Thank you, gentlemen.
First of all, thank you all. Can you hear me okay? This is my first time doing this, so bear with me, folks. As Mike said, this first piece I'm going to read is from my collection, Something in the Air, which I have a few copies in the room. It's called The Bright Heart of Eternity. Phil let out a long, relaxed sigh, held his arms up over his head and stretched as if waking up from an afternoon nap. He opened his eyes and quickly shut them again, blinded by a bright summer sun like the ones he remembered from his childhood so many years before. Holding up a hand to block the sunlight, he slowly opened his eyes again and waited for his vision to adjust itself to his surroundings. After a moment, he rose from the waist up, put his arms behind him to prop himself up, and looked around. He was lying in the middle of a vast meadow, the unshorn grass and bright yellow and purple flowers swaying through the caress of a warm, gentle breeze. The sky was cloudless, a great azure sea that seemed to stretch out forever. "Now how the hell did I get here?" he asked aloud. "Come to think of it, where is here?" The sound of his own voice took him by surprise. There was a renewed strength and youthful resonance that it had not earlier possessed. And then he realized something else. That warm, gentle breeze that caressed the grass and flowers was also caressing his body in a fashion he had not felt for more years than he remembered. Glancing down at himself, he realized with a start that he was as naked as the day he was born. No, he was more than simply naked. He was transformed. Where before he would have seemed a frail, wizened shell of a man in his 90s, there now sat a strapping, robust, much younger fellow whom he could not remember ever having been. He leapt to his feet with a vigor that almost scared him. He held his hands and arms before his eyes, amazed at the power and vitality they now seemed to possess. He rubbed his palms over his face and realized that the wrinkles that had once lined his visage had disappeared. Hell, he even had a full head of hair. He tried to think of something to say, but for one of the few times he could remember, words failed him. The first thing that came to mind, holy shit, just didn't seem appropriate somehow. So instead he just laughed and danced around like a child on Christmas morning, marveling at this unexpectedly gracious gift the universe had seen fit to bestow, and wondering just what he might have done to deserve it. He was still dancing about when he thought he caught a glimpse of another man there in the distance, running in his direction with a look of determination etched upon his features. As the stranger grew closer, Phil had the feeling he had seen him somewhere before, but he could not be certain. Certainly there was something familiar about him, but it was the kind of vague familiarity that one sometimes feels about someone they only think they might have encountered at some point. Carrying a broadsword, clad only in a loincloth with a huge battle axe strapped across his back, the stranger sprinted gracefully across the grass, and at first did not seem to notice Phil's presence. In fact, Phil thought at first he might pass by without seeing him at all. After a moment, however, the stranger slowed and changed direction ever so slightly, approaching Phil with an amused expression. Phil thought that expression may have stemmed from the sight of his own nudity. Suddenly self-conscious, he glanced about in hopes of finding some kind of shrub to step behind. There were none. "Hello there," the stranger called as he came closer. "Are you friend or foe?" When Phil didn't immediately answer, the stranger cocked his head slightly to one side, his expression darkening slightly. "Well, which is it?" I don't know," Phil finally replied. "That depends on you, I guess. I hope a friend. I can't imagine that I have any quarrel with someone I've just met for the first time." The stranger grunted softly in response. "Fair enough," he said. "Where are you headed?" Phil looked around again. "That's a good question," he said. "I don't know where I am or how I got here." He paused for a moment and wrinkled his forehead in consternation. "To tell the truth, all of a sudden I'm not even sure who I am. I remember lying in my bed at home, feeling very tired and lightheaded, and I guess I must have drifted off to sleep. Then I wake up a few minutes ago, stark naked in the middle of nowhere, looking 70 years younger and feeling better than I remember feeling in a good many years. It's all very strange." A flicker of recognition flashed in the stranger's eyes, and he grinned. Yes, he said softly, I remember that feeling. Something about the stranger's expression tickled Phil's memory, and he once again found himself wondering why. After a moment, he shrugged and surveyed his surroundings once more. After a moment, he mused, I'm guessing this isn't Riverworld then, is it? No, the stranger told him. It's not Barzoom either. Then his grin turned into a full-fledged smile, and he added, It's better. Phil whirled around to face the stranger again. Did you say Barzoom? The stranger only nodded in response, and then it was Phil's turn to grin in recognition. After a moment's silence, the stranger reached out and placed a hand on Phil's shoulder as a gesture of fellowship. Stay well then, friend. I hope your voyage is a pleasant one. With that, he turned and started to jog away in the direction he had been going when Phil first spied him. At first, Phil just stood and watched his departure, but before the stranger had gone very far, he heard Phil calling after him. Hey, Phil cried as he sprinted to catch up. As the stranger stopped and turned to face him, Phil added, Please, wait just a minute. There's so much I don't understand, and something tells me you're the one who can answer my questions. So if you don't mind the company, I'd like to come with you. The stranger gave the request just a few seconds' thought. All right, he answered. Here, take this. He handed his sword to Phil and reached behind him, taking the battle axe in hand. You'll need it where we're going. Phil looked upon the sword and smiled, admiring the way it felt in his hands as he used the weapon to cut a swath through the air in front of him. Then he looked up at his new friend. Thank you, he said with a mixture of awe and respect. By the way, my name's Phil. The stranger smiled again as he reached out to shake Phil's hand. I'm Ed, he answered. Now let's be off. There's a princess to be rescued, and not a moment to waste. He took a single step forward before stopping and turning to face Phil again. But first, let's see if we can't find you something to wear. Phil returned his smile as the two of them set out across the grassy terrain toward whatever adventure might lie ahead. And the story is lovingly dedicated to the memories of Philip Jose Farmer and Edgar Rice Burroughs. That one was a lot of fun to write. That one actually was published in the FarmerCon Memorial Program in 2009. Is that when that was? I wasn't able to be there, but that was my contribution that year. So. And then the second piece will be, as Mike said, a scene from my story from the most recent Avenger anthology. The story is called Ghost of Thunder Isle, and it is actually a sequel to a Doc Savage story that appeared in the first issue of Marvel's black and white Doc Savage magazine back in the 1970s. So I managed to find a way to combine two of my favorite characters into a single story. The morning headlines all screamed the latest news about the several recent slayings in the Central Park area. Unfortunately, Nellie Gray thought as she glanced at the newsstand while waiting to cross West 57th, the latest news was in fact no news at all, but merely a reiteration of what had already been reported several times previously. That the murders, 3 in all, had all occurred at night on consecutive Fridays. That the deaths had been particularly grisly, a fact which had led one paper to dub the unknown killer the Friday Night Ripper. That the police were no closer to finding the culprit today than they had been after the first murder. But Nellie knew one thing that the morning papers didn't. The killings had attracted the attention of one whom every evildoer had reason to fear, Richard Henry Benson, the man whom many had come to know as the Avenger. The steely-eyed nemesis of crime had been away and involved in another case when the first 2 murders occurred, but hearing of the third a week ago had stirred the bitter rage that had consumed Benson's being since the disappearance of his wife and daughter not quite a year ago. The intensity of that rage, a white-hot fire to begin with, was magnified all the more by the apparent randomness and wanton violence of these killings. And so he had sworn to bring the killer to justice. To that end, Benson had spent last night, the 4th Friday night since the killings began, in Central Park, disguised as a panhandler in hopes of attracting the murderer's attention. He was accompanied by his associates, Fergus McMurdy and Algernon Heathcote Smith, Smitty if you valued life and limb, whose job it was to keep the chief under constant radio surveillance and stand ready to rush in to assist him should the killer show up. It had been Nellie's intention to join them, but the overprotective Smitty wouldn't hear of it. It's too dangerous, the usually soft-spoken giant had protested, And Benson, somewhat uncharacteristically, Nellie thought, given that he'd seen her prove her capabilities time and time again, had agreed. She didn't like it, but she knew there was no arguing with the chief. Nellie had gone home to sulk, but her sour mood had lifted when her old friend Angelica had called to invite her to breakfast. She said she had some wonderful news to share. Nellie was certain it had something to do with Peter Russell, whom she'd had a hand in introducing to Angelica. They made a good couple, Nellie thought, and if ever there was someone who deserved that kind of happiness, it was Angelica. And so, just this once, she was happy to put the team's latest case out of her mind long enough to share her friend's joy. It was nice to remember every now and then that there was more going on in the world than just doom and destruction. Her bright mood lasted until Nellie crossed 54th and turned left on 8th Avenue. That's when she noticed several policemen milling about in front of an apartment building in the middle of the block. Angelica's apartment building, Nellie realized as she walked closer, and her feeling of joy began giving way to a sense of dread. Nellie's walk became a near sprint as she hurried up the block, then slowed again as she recognized one of the policemen. Officer Reagan's eyes lit up as he noticed the petite blonde coming towards him. He knew of her association with Richard Benson, whom he had had occasion to meet several times over the past year. "Morning, Miss Gray," he said as she walked up. "Hello, Officer Reagan," Nellie responded. "What's going on?" "A woman was murdered in her apartment sometime last night," Reagan told her, "up on the 6th floor. One of her neighbors found her this morning. I haven't been up there myself yet, but I heard it's not a pretty picture." Nellie's sense of dread grew stronger. After a moment, she said, "I'm going up." She turned and headed for the building entrance. Reagan followed right behind. I'm not so sure that's a good idea, Miss Gray." Nellie stopped and spun to face the officer. She started to say something, stopped, and took a breath instead. Then she looked up at the taller policeman, determination burning in her blue eyes. "I said I'm going up," she told him in a soft but defiant tone. "Yes, ma'am," Reagan said. Past experience with Nellie and her associates had taught him not to argue further. She turned and he trailed her as far as the entrance. "It's all right, Johnson," he told another officer who tried to prevent Nellie from going inside. "Let her go." Officer Johnson took a step back and Nellie turned and gave Reagan a look of gratitude. Reagan nodded in response and slid his cap back and scratched his head as he watched her walk through the door. Moments later, Nellie exited the elevator on the 6th floor, and her heart sank as she realized that it was indeed Angelica's apartment where the police and a handful of nosy onlookers were congregated. Despite her diminutive size, she managed to push her way through the small crowd and walk into the apartment. The color drained from her already pale complexion at the sight that greeted her. There was blood all over the living room. A partially unclad female body, drenched in blood and looking like it had been attacked by some kind of wild animal, lay on the floor near the bedroom door. Nellie didn't need to get a closer look to know that it was Angelica. Off to one side on the sofa, an elderly woman sat distraught as she attempted to answer questions being asked by a pair of plainclothesmen. Nellie turned her back on the grisly scene, a single tear running down the side of her face as she squeezed her eyes shut. She placed a hand on the wall next to the doorframe to steady herself. She had seen more than one dead body in the short time she had been associated with Benson and his crew, starting with that of her own father, the murder that led to that association in the first place. But this one was different. This was as close to pure, unadulterated evil as she'd ever felt herself near. "Excuse me, can I help you?" From the corner of her eye, Nellie saw one of the two plainclothesmen walking towards her. She gathered her composure and turned to face him. The detective paused for just a second, then continued in her direction. "I'm sorry, Nellie Gray, isn't it?" Nellie's head tilted slightly to one side as she wondered if she'd met him before. Then it occurred to her. He had been one of the detectives assigned to the investigation of her father's murder prior to Benson's involvement. "Detective Cardona," she said in greeting. Like Officer Reagan, Cardona knew of Nellie's status as a member of Benson's team. "Don't tell me the Avenger sent you," the detective said. Surely even he couldn't have heard about this so soon. Nellie shook her head. "No," she told him. "Angelica Tremaine is a friend of mine. I was supposed to have breakfast with her." "Oh, I'm sorry." Cardona's tone told Nellie that he truly was. She looked up at him and asked, "What happened?" "You're still trying to figure that out," Cardona answered. He pointed over to the woman who was still talking to the other detective. "That's her neighbor, Mrs. Fry. Apparently she was walking down the hallway this morning looking for her cat when she noticed Miss Tremaine's door was open. She stuck her head inside to see if anything was wrong, and this is what she found." Cardona looked back at Nellie. How well did you know Miss Tremaine? We attended Vassar together, Nellie answered. We were like sisters back then grew apart when life after college took us in different directions. It's only been in the last couple of years that we reconnected. Can you think of anyone who would want to hurt her? Nellie shook her head. No. She glanced back in the direction of her friend's remains and quickly turned away again. I've never seen anything quite like this, she said, more to herself than to Cardona. Cardona made an unpleasant face. I have, he told Nellie in a tone that suggested he wished it weren't true. In Central Park on each of the last 3 Fridays. Nellie looked up quickly at the detective. Excuse me, I need to got something caught in my throat, folks. Sorry about that. Oh, boy. Sorry about that. Before she could finish the question, Nellie's attention was diverted by a commotion out in the hallway. A man was screaming as he tried to break free of several policemen who were fighting to keep him from entering the apartment. You've got to let me inside, the man cried, as he swung his shoulders back and forth in an attempt to release the officer's hold on him. I said let me in. Cardona headed over to help the officers. Nellie gasped as she recognized the overwrought fellow. Peter, she exclaimed as she rushed in his direction. Peter Russell looked in her direction. Nellie, he called. Cardona saw they knew one another and motioned for the officers to turn Peter loose. Peter and Nellie embraced, and then Peter drew back and looked into the woman's eyes. Nellie, what's going on? He pleaded. Why are they trying to keep from me? Nellie could feel her heart breaking as she tried to answer. Peter, it's Angelica. She paused and took a breath, trying to hold back further tears. She's been killed. She watched as Peter's face contorted into an expression of grief. His gaze darted about the room, noticing for the first time the carnage on display. Then his attention fixed on the eviscerated remains of the woman he proposed to just the night before. Peter sank to his knees and lowered his head, squeezing his eyes shut as if trying to will the memory of that vision from his mind. Nellie knew from experience that he would not be able to do so. She knelt beside him, placed her dainty arm around his broad shoulders to comfort him. He buried his face in her arm and let the tears flow unashamed. Cardona left him there as he went back to talk again with Mrs. Fry. After a moment, Peter regained his composure long enough to look up at Nellie. My God, who would want to do this to her, he asked. I don't know, Nellie admitted sorrowfully, but we're going to find out, and I know just the man to help. And it goes from there. Sorry.
You all right there?
Yeah, something got lodged in there.
Did you want to provide any further comments or context about the book?
If anyone has any questions before Wynn goes on.
I got the Officer Reagan reference. Was Officer Johnson somebody too?
No, Johnson was just a name because I couldn't think of anybody else, to be honest with you.
Okay.
I think I did originally have another person in mind, but then there was some concern about whether I could use that person or not, even in such a brief reference. So rather than risk any kind of problems, I just let it go and just used a fairly generic name. I did want to use the Reagan reference just because I've become a big fan of the Blue Bloods TV show, and I like the idea of a multi-generational family of cops. So I thought that was one I could get away with. So.
Plus, the guy's name really was Johnson.
Yeah, the guy's name really was Johnson. He wouldn't let me change it.
All right. We'll take some more questions for both Art and myself after I do some brief readings. Yeah. So first, I'd like to read a brief excerpt from the new novella that has just been released here at Pulpfest and FarmerCon called The Scarlet Jaguar. It's an original Pat Wildman adventure. This is volume 2 of the memoirs of Pat Wildman. Some of you who may be familiar with the series will know that volume 1 was The Evil in Pemberley House, which I wrote in collaboration with Philip Jose Farmer. A little bit of context or background. Pat Wildman, or Patricia Wildman, is the daughter of Pulp hero Doc Wildman, who was a bronze champion of justice in the 1930s and 40s. In the original novel, The Evil in Pemberley House, Pat, or Patricia, has lost her parents and discovers, after sort of having a very bad time in her life, that she is the potential heiress to a grand estate in the United Kingdom in Derbyshire called Pemberley House. And the novel is essentially how she comes about to actually accept her inheritance. We have the requisite evil people who may be out to kill her, a scheme about a ghost, or perhaps it's a real ghost. We're really not sure. And, how does she triumph over that, and kind of in doing so also come to get over the loss of her parents, who were recently deceased. The Evil in Pemberley House takes place in the spring of 1973. And then we have a brief postscript, which takes place 6 months later in the autumn of 1973. The Scarlet Jaguar then brings us forward to summer of 1974. And Pat has really come into her own and has decided that after having triumphed against some of the nasty folks the prior year, that she's going to follow in her father's footsteps and take a crack at fighting evildoers all over the world. So the Scarlet Jaguar is, I'll read the brief blurb to give you a sense of what the overall story is about. Pat Wildman and her crew race against time, deep in the wilds of the Central American jungle, to face the menace of the Scarlet Jaguar's weird power to eliminate his enemies from afar, marked only by a wisp of crimson smoke, smoke resembling nothing so much as the head of a blood-red, screaming jaguar. But who, or what, is the Scarlet Jaguar? A power-mad dictator determined to reclaim power? A revolutionary movement bent on taking over the country of Jiboom and the rest of Central America? Or a front for something even more sinister? So I'll read the very brief foreword and the first chapter, which is also fairly short. And then if we have time, I will do a very brief reading from another piece. So the foreword. In the summer of 2009, while on a 2-week sojourn to the United Kingdom with my wife and several close friends, I was fortunate enough to be granted an audience with Lady Patricia Clark Lupin Wildman, the Duchess of Greystoke. I had recently discovered in the files of the American science fiction author Philip Jose Farmer the partial manuscript, notes, and outlines for what became the novel in the Evil in Pemberley House. Also in Phil's files was the correspondence that Lady Patricia had had with him in early 1973. This formed the basis for some information included, at the proverbial last minute, in Doc Savage, His Apocalyptic Life, the 1973 biography of Dr. James Clark Wildman, Jr., the man who was the real-life basis for a popular character who appeared in pulp magazines in the 1930s and 40s. And then I go on to talk a little bit about our visit with Lady Patricia at her estate in Derbyshire, Pemberley House, and discuss a few of some of the burning questions that we have for Lady Patricia, including the final fate of her father. And she declines to answer about that, admonishing me to be patient and to wait for her memoirs, which she will share with me in due course. In order. So essentially, what we have here is that she's shared her memoirs with me, and I'm duly sort of recording them for posterity and releasing them to the world. All right. So chapter 1. Summer 1974. The shrieking whine, almost like a feline roar, pierced the deep night, bringing Patricia Wildman bolting straight up in bed, heart almost hammering out of her chest. She flung the covers aside and flew from the massive four-poster bed. Panting in the pitch-black room, she drove slumber's cobwebs away and turned on the bedside table lamp. The hellish noise raised even more in pitch. It was coming from somewhere outside her bedroom. Pat raced to the velvet-covered bench at the base of the bed, taut muscles sliding smoothly under her naked, bronzed skin. She grabbed a filmy black negligee and pulled it on. It did little to cover her splendid figure. Pat unlocked the bedroom door and sprang into the hall. Down the sumptuously decorated corridor, Parker was also emerging from his room, ash-blonde hair tousled and alarm in his light gray eyes. "I think it's coming from Emma's room," he said as he pulled a bathrobe on, and Pat nodded in agreement. She dashed back into her bedroom, grabbed a sterling silver candelabrum with 3 tapers, and lit them quickly with her Zippo. She met Parker, who had grabbed a spring-powered flashlight, back in the hallway. The candles and flash in concert cast weird shadows as they raced down the well-appointed Regency passageway. Through archways and past tall marble statues and hanging tapestries they raced, and there came an ear-splitting scream, different from the previous animal-like growl. They skidded to a halt in front of Emma's bedroom door, near the landing at the top of a wide marble staircase leading to the lower level of the great house. Pat tried the doorknob, but the door was locked. From inside they could hear the competing wails, Emma's horrified sobs, and the weird, piercing whine that was like no sound Pat had ever heard before. A split of thunder from a nighttime summer storm added to the cacophony. Parker threw his shoulder against the heavy door, to no avail, and Pat had flashbacks to over a year ago, her second night in Pemberley House, locked in her own bedroom, while Parker banged on the door to be let in, summoned by the maid who had heard Pat's own midnight cries in the midst of a raging storm. Pat pushed back the memories and locked them away. This wasn't the time or place. She pulled Parker aside, took a step back, pivoted, and launched a side kick at the weakest part of the door, next to the knob. Just like her karate master in Detroit had taught her, she thought with satisfaction. The tough wood splintered. Parker again put his solidly muscled shoulder to the weakened door, and it flew open. He sprawled in the doorway, landing on his side and rolling. Pat leaped over him, dashing inside, to find their guest, young Emma Ponsonby, standing frozen in the middle of the bedroom floor, gasping in terror, pointing one clawed hand in horror at something just out of Pat's line of sight. Pat swung to the right, taking in the gilt mirrors, dark wood sideboard, paintings, and heavy chests of drawers. Then she saw it. The statues of the Tyrannosides, Harmodius and Astragytian, were the highlights of the already lavish guest bedroom. It sat in a specially constructed alcove next to the French windows, having been brought back to England from Greece in the 1820s by her distant relative, Sir William Clayton, who had visited there while he was on fire for Hellenic independence. The bronze statue of the 2 Athenian heroes who killed the tyrant Hipparchus was a symbol of democracy to the ancient Athenians, except it was no longer made of bronze. The statue had been turned to some kind of blood-red glass. Crimson smoke swirled around it and rose from the now glass heads of Harmodius and Astragytian. The smoke eddied and formed above the Athenian heads, the gaseous scarlet image of a scarlet jaguar. Emma continued to sob and shake. Pat grabbed a heavy robe and threw it about her naked shoulders just as Parker regained his feet and entered the room. "My God!" he exclaimed. Footsteps came from the hall, followed by a knock from the doorway. "Lady Patricia?" It was Miss Neston, the maid. "The whole house is up and about. What's happened? Is everything all right?" "Stay outside, please," Pat replied. "We'll be out in a moment." She began to trundle the shaken Emma into Parker's arms when again came the feral cry from the main floor downstairs. Pat changed direction, pulling Emma along with her into the hall and pushing her into Miss Neston's arms. "Take her to another room and lock the door," Pat ordered. "Is it the poachers again?" Miss Neston continued. "I have no idea. Just do it," Pat said. "Pete, come on." They raced down the massive marble staircase, taking 2 steps at a time. Ahead of them, the feline growl accelerated into a brain-splitting whine. They covered their ears as they turned the corner and came upon the long, wide hall leading to the library. The sound came from that book-lined room, and they darted in. Standing near the library's windows, hands clasped to his ears, face contorted in a horrific grimace, was the butler, Deeds. He was frozen, immobile, a red glass statue. The hellish noise stopped abruptly, and then came a massive crash as crimson glass shattered, exploding outward and falling to the wooden floor in millions of tiny shards. Pat and Parker dived for cover behind a large sofa. When the dust settled and they dared raise their eyes, they saw the same Scarlet Jaguar's head in the reddish smoke coiling above the carnage. And to find out who, or what, is the Scarlet Jaguar. So I think we have time. Would you like to hear about a same-length reading from the Honey West T.H.E. cat novel, A Girl and Her Cat? So this book is not yet available, not yet published, but it should be solicited for ordering fairly soon. And we're waiting for completion of the final cover art, which I'm told should be any day now. And then the publisher, Moonstone Books, will be putting out the pre-order. They need the cover art in order to place it in the diamond previews and so forth. But for those of you who may not be familiar with Honey West and or T.H.E. Cat, and I don't know if you can see this, this is not the final cover art, but here is a Honey West paperback book cover and a comic book cover, a photo cover of T.H.E. Cat, which was a television series that ran for one season in the 1960s with Robert Loggia as Thomas Hewitt Edward Cat, the cat burglar. So the Honey West project is an interesting one to me. It's a lot of fun. And the Moonstone version of Honey West, we're being very faithful to the paperback novels, of which there were 11, written by G.G. Fickling, which is a pseudonym for a husband and wife writing team of Skip and Gloria Fickling. There were 11 Honey West novels from 1957 until 1971, most of them published between 1957 and 1964, and then there was a break, and then 2 more were published in the early 70s. And in between that break of novels, there was a television series that also ran for one season with Anne Francis as Honey West. And so what we've done with the Moonstone version is actually taken the best of both versions. So what you'll see in our novel is an amalgamation. It's definitely the Honey West of the paperback series, and I constructed, as I usually do, a Honey West chronology to make sure that I was getting the order of events right and the placement of our novel correct within the timeline of the other stories. And again, referring both to the events of the novels and the TV series and trying to sort of smooth out the continuity between both of those. And of course, we're also honoring the continuity in the timeline of T.H.E. Cat. An interesting other tidbit about Honey West is that the last novel in the 60s, 1964, she's a private detective, as she always has been since the 50s. But this novel, Bombshell in 1964, she is in a typical sort of PI case, private eye case, but she gets drawn into a sort of very James Bondian type of scenario in which she goes up against American Nazis in Florida who have hijacked a nuclear submarine. And she also meets for the first time Johnny Doom, who also then kind of goes on and becomes a secret agent. In the last 2 novels in the early 70s, we find Honey West. She is a full-fledged secret agent now. She's working for the CIA. There's not a transition between the 64 novel and the 71 novels. And so we saw that as an opportunity to kind of bridge that gap. Clearly, she did not immediately become a secret agent, as her friend Johnny Doom did, because she had the events of the TV series, which followed that 1964 exodus. And because of that, it's clear that she continued to be a private eye for at least another couple of years, and then was kind of pulled into that secret agent James Bond kind of world again. And so we kind of take that tack with our novel, A Girl and Her Cat. And I will share with you if you can see this, and I apologize that it is hard to see. This is the initial cover sketch for the cover of the book. So this will turn into the painting. This is a cover sketch by Doug Klauba, who has done a lot of really great covers, such as The Green Hornet and The Phantom, Kolchak, Zorro, and so forth. So that's kind of the setup for A Girl and Her Cat. And then Thomas Hewitt Edward Cat, again, is a reformed cat burglar turned bodyguard who works in San Francisco during the same time frame. So I'll start with the prologue, which takes place in June 1967. And then we will jump back in time a couple of days. So really the prologue kind of dumps you right in the middle of the action, right in the middle of the story. And then with chapter 1, we'll go back to a few days earlier. And I'm not going to read this in my best Anne Francis voice, despite the fact that this is written in first person. I awoke to the cool bossa nova strains of The Girl from Ipanema. I was laid out on the floor. It was also cool, downright cold, in fact. Even in summertime, a tile floor is going to be cold, especially in San Francisco, if that's where I still was. I stretched experimentally before sitting up. My head felt like one of my cashmere sweaters, washed, wrung, and hung out to dry. Speaking of my cashmere sweater, I slipped my hands down around my 38, 22, 36 assets. It was there. The sweater, I mean. And my skirt, both still clung tightly to every curve. Saying that in a man's voice probably does not work that well, and I do apologize for that.
It would work in San Francisco.
I have a tendency to lose these things, and more, especially before or after waking up in strange places. The last thing I remembered, I was wearing a short satin robe and nothing else. So being fully clothed was a bonus. Things were going well. Another bonus, the room was dimly lit, keeping the pounding of my skull from becoming TNT explosions. I scoped the place out a bit before venturing onto my feet. Dripping candles on wrought iron sconces bracketed the small space. There didn't seem to be any electric lights in the room. More ornate ironwork, of some Arabian design, decorated the small window. Was it secure enough to prevent escape? A small washstand stood alone in the corner. Hand towels in an intricate Turkish pattern were neatly stacked by the sink. A variety of perfume bottles peppered the counter opposite the towels. On a ledge above the sink, under a gilt silver mirror, a lump of frankincense burned on a hot coal. Smelled like hojari, good for a cold, damp climate like Frisco's, if I was still in Frisco. I rolled over to see what was behind me, opposite the washstand. A stall, the wooden door elaborately carved in a design that made me think of gypsies. Just under the door, I could see the base of a commode. Fortunately, it was unoccupied. A ladies' room. I had been laid out on the floor of the ladies' room and God knows where. I moved unsteadily to the sink and splashed some water on my face. The hand towels were perfumed. Nice touch. I stumbled to the door, fumbled with the knob, and lurched out into an equally dim nightclub. More large candles filled the place. There was no other lighting, but the candles were enough. To my right, I could see a small jazz combo, still sketching out Ipanema. The bass player wore a black beret and a goatee. The singer was hauntingly beautiful. She might have been straight from Brazil. In front of me, across the room and slightly to my left, a wide set of stone steps led up to what was presumably the exit, doors covered in scrolling wrought iron similar to that in the bathroom. I always look for the exit first. Small tables, illuminated by lamps with tea candles, were arranged around the room. Couples held hands and sipped martinis. Swords, knives, maces, and axes adorned the walls, framed by luxuriant tapestries. The whole place screamed a bohemian. I wavered a bit again. The room went dark for me for a moment. When my eyes started working again, I was down on one knee. I looked up to see a good-looking guy standing over me. He was tall with straight dark hair and wore a black blazer with a white dress shirt and a black cravat. He was slender, but I could sense the powerfully coiled muscles concealed under the evening wear. My mind was still vague. I thought I recognized him, but my mouth hadn't caught up with my brain. I asked, "Who?" He held out a hand to help me up. "Cat," he answered. T. Hewitt Edward Cat. The band switched to something more brassy, with a flute and bongos, something like a Lalo Schifrin tune. I took his hand. And that's the prologue. If any of you have ever seen The Cat, and maybe you haven't, Art's nodding. Art gets it. So we'll jump back to a few days earlier. One of the characters who recurs in the Honey West novels is a lieutenant by the name of Mark Storm, Lieutenant Mark Storm. And he is a character who is available to us to work with the Honey West novels. And Matthew Baugh and I, Matthew's my co-writer on this book, decided that we had plenty of characters going on and that was a little bit too much to juggle. And we had some other characters that we wanted to deal with. So we don't really use Mark Storm much in this book. Something else that's very interesting is in the 1970 novel, it explains that Mark Storm had proposed marriage to Honey. She had declined. They had fought and then not seen each other for years until 1971. And so I'm going to skip over that scene, but that scene is in here where they have the fight and they part ways for many years. And that's our way of eliminating and not dealing with Mark Storm. Again, fitting continuity. I'll also say that Mark Storm, in my reading of the novels, is a complete and didn't really like the character and didn't really want to spend very much time writing him. He's kind of that kind of guy who is always bugging Honey to get married, stay home, and have kids, and why is she going out and doing this private eye thing? And she's always sort of thumbing her nose at him and getting in trouble, and he's not very kind to her, actually, even though she solves murder after murder after murder. So another reason for not using him. So Honey has had a fight with Mark. She's upset. She goes back to her apartment and begins to become embroiled in the adventure of a girl and her cat. At home, I fed Bruce and made myself a drink. I stretched out the boots on the radiator and hoped for the best. Her boots just got ruined in the rain. I ran a hot shower and stood under it for 15 minutes, trying to warm up from the chilly, rain-drenched walk home. I liked Mark, even had some feelings for the guy, but it was never going to work. Bruce is the ocelot, by the way. Bruce is the pet ocelot, Honey West's pet from the TV series. Bruce curled up outside the tub, waiting and purring. I figured the only man I needed in my life was the furry, four-legged kind. Bruce is an ocelot. Some might think it's odd that I keep a pet ocelot, but I love him and I'm an odd girl, so guilty as charged. Not that I spend a lot of time worrying about what other people think. I turned off the shower, felt around in the steam for the towels, and wrapped one around my dripping hair. I tried to tie the other towel around my chest, and it came undone. I needed to get some bigger towels. I topped off my drink and climbed in bed. Bruce jumped up and took over the other side of the bed, which was fine by me. I rubbed him behind the ears, and he started purring again, loudly. I lay there in the dark, reached for my drink on the nightstand, took a few more sips, and lay there some more, wide awake. Why did every man I worked with want to marry me? Mark had been after me for years. Sam Bolt, smart guy, had worked for me as a part-time investigator for about a year, maybe a little more. We had argued here and there, but had also flirted, and that's the way I liked it. Light, breezy. Then he had wanted to get married. Maybe I'd known it all along, but it was the same old story. Let's get married, I'll take over the business, you can run things here at the office. Not a chance, Buster. And then there was newsman Fred Sims. Like Mark, he had also known my father. He was a vet, wounded in the war, and walked with a cane. He was generally quiet and reserved with me, and I had always wondered if he was embarrassed by the cane. I also had the feeling he was interested in me, though he kept it to himself. I really only got an inkling of it when he and Mark and I spent time together, and our conversation took a bawdy turn as the boys competed for my attention. I enjoyed our innocent flirtations, although perhaps it was not so innocent on Fred's part. Why all these men wanted to tie me down, try to capture something they couldn't have, was beyond me. I had made it clear, and often, it wasn't happening. The only one I hadn't had to fend off was Charlie April, the gravelly voice on the other end of my answering service. Of course, I hardly ever saw the guy in person, and as far as I knew, he had no interest in any women. Either he was too busy for it, running his bookie service, or whatever it was, I didn't ask too many questions about it, or he didn't like girls, or both. None of my business either way, and that's the way I liked it. Clean, simple, untangled. Anyway, tonight with Mark had been the last straw. I stared at the ceiling. It was 2 a.m. I stared at the ceiling some more. I gave up, threw on some tight leopard print capris and a black sweater, and hooked a leash to Bruce's collar. We walked downstairs. The rain had stopped and the air was clean and crisp. The stars twinkled. I put down the top on the Cobra, threw it in gear, and drove 3 blocks to the office. Bruce sat in the passenger seat. The streets were empty this early in the morning, and no one was out and about to gawk at us. People gawked when we drove around like this in broad daylight. We liked it. I parked in the alley behind the office. Bruce perked up as we stopped, recognizing the familiar destination. I took his leash, went up 3 flights, unlocked the door, and flipped on the desk lamp. Bruce lapped some water from the bowl on the floor, and I settled in behind the desk to pay some overdue bills. I put the bills in the outbox and opened my current case files. I tried hard to focus on the work. There was a divorce case which I would have rather not taken, but I needed the dough, and an insurance fraud case. I hadn't tripped over a dead body in months. Honey West, Danger Girl, that was me. The ship's horn gave forth a mournful wail from Long Beach Harbor. There was a knock on the door. It was 3:15 a.m. and I was alone in a deserted office building with no night watchman, burning the midnight oil. My desk light shone through the door's frosted glass and under the door frame, so whoever was on the other side could tell the office was occupied and was polite enough to give a warning knock. But in this business, you don't take any chances. I reached into my purse, grabbed my pearl handle .22, and held it in readiness under the desk. "Come in," I said. The door opened. The shadowy figure framed in the doorway looked curvy, but I didn't let my guard down. A woman can fire a gun just as well as a man. I was proof of that. "Would you mind stepping into the light?" I said. I swiveled the desk lamp toward the visitor and caught her in a pool of yellow light. She was an Asian knockout. Long, glossy black hair fell straight down both sides of her face. Her almond-shaped eyes were a piercing cat green. She wore a short, belted raincoat and black boots. The way I said all-American girl, she said exotic, and maybe even dangerous. She wasn't holding a gun or a knife or anything else in her hand, so I invited her to sit. "A bit late, or early, for a business call," I said. "I wish to hire you to recover stolen property," she said. "Okay, so much for small talk." "I might be for hire," I said. "Who am I working for?" "My name is Isabella Fang." Her voice was cold. "Fang?" I restrained a smile, imagining this woman as a she-Dracula. The image fit her. "It is not an uncommon Chinese name," she said, the chill deepening in her voice. "Sorry," I said. "Now, Miss Fang—" "Miss West," she interrupted. "I have a doctorate in biochemistry from UC Berkeley, a doctorate in botany from Oxford, and a doctorate in medicine from Johns Hopkins. You may address me as Dr. Fang." I didn't care for the way she condescended, but this isn't a business where you always get to like your clients. I decided to let it slide. "That's an impressive resume, Doctor," I said. "So what can I do for you?" "I need your help in recovering something that was taken from me." "Have you been to the police?" I asked. "They're the real experts with stolen property." "The police cannot help," she replied, producing a pack of red apple cigarettes and a long black holder. "I cannot prove that the property is mine." "Okay," I said. "How does that work?" She placed a slender cigarette in the tip of the holder, lighted it, and took a drag before answering. "Ah, forgive me," she said coyly. She blinked those unnerving green eyes at me. Would you like one? I shook my head. I'm a research chemist, Dr. Feng continued. I spent many years developing a vaccine for rubella. The only samples were stolen from my San Francisco laboratory. That sounded familiar to me. I'd read a magazine article about vaccines a while back. They'd finally found one that was good for mumps and were making real progress with measles and rubella, which sounded great to me. You have the formula, right? I asked. Can't you recreate it? Developing the vaccine took years, Miss West, she said. I suppose she could have said it with more disdain if she had really just tried a little bit harder. Could we please confine ourselves to matters in which you actually can be of service? I bit back my real reply and said, Sure, just trying to gather all the facts, Doctor. Any idea who stole your vaccine samples? In fact, I do, Feng said. A rival scientist named Stippier, Dr. Carl Stippier. He wishes to take credit for my discovery. I see, I said, although I didn't, really. Anything else? Yes, when the thieves broke into my laboratory, they also stole an heirloom. My grandfather's antique pocket watch. I wish you to recover that as well. Care to share any details? I asked. A description of the pocket watch? Anything else you have on Stippier? She must have been aware I was dubious, because the check she handed me was designed to settle most of my doubts. I hadn't seen so many zeros since I'd been hired by the Marriott Beverly during a Shriners convention. Still, there was something bothering me. I don't get it, I said. Why come all the way to Los Angeles to hire a detective for a case in Frisco? You are uniquely qualified for this, Miss West, Dr. Feng replied. Dr. Stippier has a weakness for attractive women who are bountifully endowed. There are not any female private investigators in San Francisco. If you don't mind my saying so, I said, you fit that description pretty well yourself. Dr. Stippier is a racist, she replied. I heard a touch of anger in her voice, which she covered by expelling a long stream of smoke. Neither I, nor anyone who looks remotely like me, is allowed on his premises. But taffy blonde, blue-eyed, little old me. She smiled for the first time in our little interview. Precisely. That's it. Do you want to share something with us?
What would you like?
Any questions?
What prompted the crossover between Honey West and T.H.E. Cat?
That's a great question. As some of you may know, I really enjoy writing crossovers and have a bit of an affinity for crossovers. And when I was approached by Moonstone to write a Honey West story, I asked Joe Gentile, the publisher, is there a character you have licensed or is available that we could actually do a Honey West crossover? And we thought about it for a little while because this is obviously in the 60s. A lot of the properties that Moonstone have are in the 40s. And so we wanted to try to make sure to locate and find a property that fit the time frame and wasn't going to be forced from a chronological perspective. Interestingly, Moonstone is already doing a series of Honey West comics. And they had already commissioned and had a script in hand for a 2-issue comic series of Honey West and the Cat, and T.H.E. Cat. And actually, the first issue of that now is already out now, and we're awaiting the second issue. So what Joe suggested to me is, well, you could do Honey West and the Cat. You just have to have it be following that comic series. And so they've already met. And so when Honey meets the Cat in this novella, she will already have worked with him once from the Moonstone series about a year prior. And it just kind of all fell into place. Two really interesting characters that we were looking forward to juxtaposing, sort of the handsome bodyguard guy and, do-it-yourself, plucky private investigator, and kind of see how they mix. Lucas.
Considering that T.H.E. Cat and Honey West are pretty much one season series, even though we're seeing elements of the paperback, could this be considered by the fans as a further continuation, at least paperback-wise, story-wise, of what could have happened if those series had survived?
If you, as a fan, would like to consider this story as a canonical adventure of Honey West, I absolutely invite you to do so. I mean, this is a licensed work, and so this is an authorized Honey West novel, and I'm looking forward to having it be the 12th Honey West novel.
You probably also mentioned that Wildman people may find this story interesting.
Wildman people might find this story interesting. For those not familiar with Wildman, just very briefly, it's a shared universe in which characters can interact with each other and coexist and have adventures together. It's not merely about crossovers. It stems from an event which led to a Wildman family of interrelated heroes and villains. We're certainly not saying that Honey West or T.H.E. Cat are members of the Wildman family at all. But it is absolutely possible that in the course of this novel that they will encounter maybe some of the more nefarious or insidious representatives of the Wildman family. Rick, you want to say something?
You mentioned that it makes you really important series.
That's a great point, Rick. Dr. Fang, who has just hired Honey West to recover the vaccine as well as a very precious pocket watch, is also a character in two of my Green Hornet stories, which also appeared in Moonstone books. So the first one was called Fang and Sting, and took place in 1964, and that was Green Hornet versus Dr. Fang. This story, the Honey West tale, takes place in 1967. I am not going to explain in the Honey West story why Dr. Fang is still alive after she apparently met her death in the 1964 Green Hornet story. That is a tale for another day. And then in the Green Hornet Progress story, which was in the third Green Hornet book, Dr. Fang actually comes back and meets up with the Green Hornet again in a very different way in the 1970s.
Speaking of the Green Hornet, I couldn't help but notice in the first thing you read from that Pat Wildman thought about a martial arts instructor that she had when she was a young girl in Detroit. I thought that was kind of interesting. It made me think of the Green Hornet for some reason.
And could you tell me a little bit more about why that made you think of the Green Hornet?
I don't know. I just know that the Green Hornet took place in Detroit, and it was a two-man team up there. Had a partner of Asian descent who was also a martial arts expert, and I just thought that was kind of interesting. I don't know if there's a connection there, but
There is a connection there, Chuck, and you are brilliant. Brilliant for pointing out, yes. Pat Wildman, just like her father, learned from many different tutors and instructors in many different arts. And so if you know anything about Doc Wildman, he was trained from birth to be a hero and learned many different arts, both physical and mental and academic, and he gave the same type of education to his daughter. And so, yeah, he absolutely sent his daughter Pat to work with and learn from a respected Asian master of martial arts whose exploits were recorded in one season of a television series from 1966 to 1967, which was produced, I think, by the same folks who produced the Batman TV series. Other questions? Anything for John about his adventure story?
I think we'll find out about what the details of
Yeah. Well, you're a pretty big fan of some of Philip Jose Farmer's Wold Newton books, aren't you, Lucas?
I will not try out.
There's one novel in particular, one of the Wold Newton series that was reprinted by Titan Books last year, in which pocket watches feature. That was called The Other Log of Phileas Fogg. There might be a connection. Yeah.
Some of the fun for me, obviously, of shows like Honey West and T.H.E. and others that you and I like to talk about is this sort of fun element, that's fun like conventions, I guess, of that era. Little gadgets and space age connected, either fashion or design or villainous plots,
Right.
And I just wonder how much of those sorts of conventions or elements did you get to have fun with in your crossover?
In the Honey West? As many as we could humanly think of. There's also an interesting, another interesting aspect to this book. If any of you are familiar with the Man from Uncle Tyan novels, which came out in the 1960s, there was a writer who participated in that series named David McDaniel. And he had a lot of fun with those novels, throwing in a lot of references. And in one of those novels, called The Rainbow Affair, it took place in May 1967, which interestingly is 1 month before the events of this book, which is June 1967. In that novel, one of the subplots had to do with Thrush. And Thrush is sort of that evil organization that Uncle fought against in the 1960s. Trying to take over the world. Thrush had been attempting to recruit Fu Manchu to join their ranks. And, of course, Fu Manchu was not named in the Rainbow Affair novel due to copyright issues. But they were trying to recruit Fu Manchu, which is a really interesting point connected to the point that you made earlier, Rick, about how Fu Manchu, moving into the 1960s, would have been sort of overshadowed by many of the other things, and maybe wouldn't be so grandiose in if he had actually had adventures in the 1960s, because you had communism and all of these other things were really overshadowing the believability of his ability to take over the world, right? And so if you extrapolate that into this other realm, by the 1960s, Fu Manchu and the C-Fan are competing with Thrush, and they're competing with Spectre, James Bond's Spectre, and all of these other organizations. And so in that novel, they're trying to get him to join them. They fail, but it's very clear that they're going to be continuing to try to recruit him. And that subplot is actually carried forward in A Girl and Her Cat. So we're playing with some of those conventions. And you're familiar, I mean, you watched the Man from Uncle TV series as well, right? So we have some cameos in this book in the David McDaniel tradition, where they, you know who they are, but they can't be named. Two agents of an international law enforcement agency show up a couple of times. One of them is black-haired and very dapper, wears a gray suit. His partner is a blonde Russian guy who wears a turtleneck, and they drive a silver Piranha sports car. Yeah, we try to have fun with it. Sir.
Was McDaniels the author of the Dagger Affair?
He was. Okay. That's exactly right.
Most detailed background of Thrush you ever got.
That's exactly right. He wrote the Dagger Affair. That was the first one. Yeah. And in that, he gives a very detailed background of Thrush, as you point out, and basically reveals to us that Thrush arose from the ashes of the late Professor Moriarty's organization after Professor Moriarty's death in 1891. And so then some of the people who were left over in that organization, eventually it evolved into Thrush. And of course, Rick has also documented some of the different variants of that organization through time as it became Thrush or had offshoots as well. And we are way over, and fortunately there was no one, I guess, after us, so I apologize for going over. But if there are more questions, or if not. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.